Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died.
Good afternoon, one and all. It's another Q&A day today, and we're going to be going through some questions that have been received on Patreon and probably reacting to some that are received on the day as well. I hope everybody's doing all right out there. Going to be getting through as many as we can. We may have to do another one of these tomorrow. So before we begin, I'll do the necessary housekeeping, which is to urge you, if you haven't already listened to the interview we did with the Armenian journalist Alison Tamizian about the situation in Armenia and the recent, though brief, war over Nagorno-Karabakh, then please be sure to do so. It's a very interesting discussion. And also the program we did yesterday on the events known as Black October in the what was then the Russian Federation, or still technically the RSFSR, which is the first part of a two-parter on that particular event. And it'll form now, I think, the basis of a series that I'll be doing on Patreon, which is going to be dedicated to Russian history in the 1990s. So going to be looking at a series of events. So we started with the so-called August coup of 1991. Going to look again at the events around Black October next week in the part 2 of our study of that particular event, and then we're going to go forward to the events surrounding the 1996 rigged election in the Russian Federation, and then we are also going to do a special couple of episodes on the Chechen Wars, the one in 94 and then the one that renewed in 99. And of course, the great economic collapse, the catastrophic collapse of the Russian economy in 1998. Going to be doing something on that. and then concluding with the rise to power of a certain Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin in 1999 to 2000. So, series of programs there coming up on Patreon. And I will now just do some plugging of the stream. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Let me just call up the relevant social media platforms here to stick this on. I'm finding you actually get more interaction off posting something on Telegram these days, given that the algorithm that appears to be operating on Twitter right now is suppressing anybody who's not paying Elon Musk for the privilege of paying for the services provided by X. Okay, right, now to begin, I'll just say hello to those who have turned up in the chat so far. So, good afternoon to Banana Bender, who's cheering on Chile in the Rugby World Cup. Don't blame you there. Don't care for the union side of things at all. I played rugby league myself at school. Dingo and Baby, good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to Rob and Lee. And good afternoon to Peter and Beans. A lot of people coming in from the perfidious Albion today. And afternoon to Will Johnson. X, not a porn site, but certainly sounds like one. You got to wonder whether that was his motivation. God knows what he's actually going to do with Twitter in the end. Probably sell it to somebody else. That would be what I would suspect he will do, is try and recoup some of the money he's put into it. Either that or sell everybody's data to third parties. So, got questions on everything from China to Chernobyl to trade union breakaways today. There is one question I'm going to put into tomorrow to cover separately. Two, in fact. I've got a question that came in as a comment on one of the videos from last week related to the role that imperialist powers play in manipulating the struggles of small nations and nationalities. That needs probably at least half an hour on its own. And there's a question about the rate of profit theory that came in off Patreon. I'll be taking that separately in tomorrow's program. But to begin with, I'm going to look at a question that came in from Sam on Patreon. And the question reads as follows. What is the current state strength of the Chinese Revolution? We're starting off with an easy one. In particular, what are we to make of their response to COVID or their apparent close cooperation with figures like Gates, Fauci, Robert Kadlec, EcoHealth Alliance, and so on? What is the correct communist line on social credit system and other authoritarian measures by the Chinese government? Are these measures part of a dictatorship of the proletariat or a threat to it? By way of background, I recently read Carlos Martinez's book on China, The East is Still Red, and what I got there was an almost entirely technocratic argument emphasizing the achievements of the Chinese government. While the list of achievements was impressive, I got no sense of the involvement or participation of the masses. The sense I got was that there had been a very significant retreat from this since the Cultural Revolution. Right, so three questions in one there. So the overall one was the current state strength of the Chinese Revolution. Well, I would say at the moment we are still in a period in China where there is an active contest inside the Communist Party of China between revolutionary forces, which I think have strengthened in recent years, and the forces of revisionism and open pro-capitalism, which were reigning there until probably the 10 years ago, the period starting 10 years ago with the rise of Xi Jinping. Now, Sam correctly points out in the question that the role of the masses isn't talked about a great deal in the book by Martinez, and I think that that is a correct judgment. I've read that book, and to be quite blunt, even though it's got some good information on it, I was not impressed by his argument at all. and I think Sam's judgment is correct. He was making an almost entirely technocratic argument, which I think is not a strong argument. But I regard Martinez essentially as a social democrat. I've read other things that he's contributed to discussions, and it seems to me that the man has the politics of a left soc dem. So I think his analysis actually reflects that. So the question of the Chinese Revolution, though, and the role of the masses. So let's deal with that first. So I think the role of the masses was undoubtedly damaged and downgraded after the Cultural Revolution. And I think that the Dengist era denigration of the Cultural Revolution is a reflection of the fact that there was a strong revisionist trend, which Deng Xiaoping personified and continues to personify in the Chinese party, who did not make a proper critical assessment of the Cultural Revolution, its successes and its failures. They were just determined to bury it and the legacies that went along with it. And the fact that they were prepared to do that, I would say, did damage the role of the masses in the revolution for quite some time. The explosions that happened in Tiananmen in 1989 and other areas in China were a reflection of two things. First of all, the fact that the openly revisionist and liquidationist wing of the party, personified not by Deng Xiaoping necessarily, but by Xiao Jiang, they were openly fostering forces in China that would seek the liquidation of the Chinese Communist Party and also the dictatorship of the proletariat in totality, to carry out a similar process, which was carried through in the Soviet Union. And thankfully, they did not succeed. And one of the remarkable things that the studies of the events around Tiananmen reveals is, of course, that the Western narrative around it is almost entirely fictional. There were an awful lot of workers' protests that broke out in 1989 in China, and this came from workers who had been frustrated by attacks on their terms and conditions and downgrading of their conditions at work, and the fact that the marketization was leaving certain sections of the working class behind. There was more exploitation of the working class. There were wealth disparities were breaking out, and this led to an awful lot of frustration that was exploited by a openly and rabidly pro-capitalist group, quite a small group within the students at Tiananmen. But they were presented as the leaders of this, and of course they had sympathizers in the form of Xiao Jiang and others in the Communist Party of China's hierarchy. Fortunately, one of the things that the Cultural Revolution did leave behind, in a positive sense, was the fact that even though it failed, it did actually strengthen the Chinese party at the base. It did terrify the reactionaries and the capitalist roaders, even though it didn't get rid of them, and even though it ultimately failed. It did solidify and strengthen the Chinese party, and it meant that there was still, even though they were a minority, a strong revolutionary wing of the party, which was able to resist the Gorbachev types in China in the 80s. I wouldn't characterize Deng Xiaoping as a liquidationist in the manner of Gorbachev, but he was a revisionist, and he was somebody whose ideas led to destabilization and almost led to the collapse of the Chinese Revolution. So when I see people praising him as some sort of great Marxist, I have to laugh, to be completely honest with you. Now, why didn't things collapse in '89? Because the revolutionary section of the party was strong enough to insist that the Gorbachev types get thrown out of their positions, and that the attempted rising that was sponsored by US imperialism, because all those student leaders who got away in 1989, nearly all of them ended up in the US, or some of them went through Hong Kong. Most of them now ended up in the US writing long think pieces for years for US academia on how China's collapse is coming any moment now. So the revolutionary wing of the party was able to prevent the collapse in '89, And the revolutionary wing that opposes and has consistently opposed the pro-capitalist measures of the Deng Xiaoping and the Yang Zemin era has remained in place and has fought a long and patient battle through the leaderships of Deng Xiaoping, Yang Zemin, Hu Jintao. And it's reached the point at the end of the 2000s, particularly after the beginning of the Great Recession of 2008 to present day, that there seemed to be a significant change within the Chinese party, given that the line that the leadership took started to move and evolve after 2012, after the coming to power of Xi Jinping. This is, of course, by his critics and his admirers, all put down to Xi himself, who undoubtedly plays a significant role. But if you read the works of Xi Jinping, what you can see that one of his central concerns and one of the party's central concerns has been that the party connection to the masses has weakened. They have acknowledged that in their internal discussions. And indeed, if you read through the works of Xi Jinping, and I've now got all 4 volumes of those because I think it's very useful as a reference point. If you look through from his earliest period as president back in 2012 through to today, he's been there for 11 years now, you can see that one of his principal concerns is the redevelopment of the party as the party of the self-sacrificing revolutionaries, of those who are prepared to work harder, sacrifice more, and also not look for personal reward. They're looking to restore the demands that were made on the revolutionaries in the Mao period, and as expressed actually in the book How to Be a Good Communist by Liu Shaoqi. So the party's decided, and Xi expresses this in his writings, that the spirit of self-sacrifice and heroism that was personified by the party in the revolutionary period needed to be restored. That the party had gained too many people within it who are nakedly corrupt, who were looking to cash in, and it was damaging the reputation of the party with the masses. So this is what lay behind the Xi Jinping instigated, though I should say the leadership instigated this collectively, anti-corruption drive. That's why you see like Chinese businessmen and state officials and military men routinely put on trial and having their pictures put in the People's Daily and the on the CGTN, the Chinese news network, of these officials who have been found guilty of corruption being sentenced to 20 to 25 years, or in some cases sentenced to death. It's an attempt to undo the damage that undoubtedly was done to the party and its reputation amongst the working class in China during the period of the Yang Zemin, or the Deng Xiaoping, Yang Zemin, and Hu Jintao leaderships. I don't think the reputation of the party was destroyed by that, because I think there was still the bulk of the party at the ground level were still self-sacrificing communists who were looking to work for the masses, looking to work and lead and live amongst the masses. It was the fact, though, that with the entry of business into the party in the form of allowing capitalists to be members, that opened the door for certain elements of corruption, and also, quite frankly, allowing pro-market reforms, and having made a success of them, it opened the door for all kinds of distortions to enter the system. I think the party in China now realizes that and are trying to rectify things. One of the things that's been done recently is that the leadership is pushing for the redevelopment of links with the masses in working class areas. I think what they're working back towards, though they're not saying it, is that, and again, I'm reading between the lines in the official statements here, so it's my interpretation, I must emphasize that, but reading all the work that Xi has done and reading his speeches and writings on the question of the party and the masses, it's clear that what they are working back towards is, at least in rhetorical terms, a restoration of the dictatorship of the proletariat, or at least a return to the emphasis that was placed on this during the New Democracy period. Now, if you were familiar with the document published by Mao back in the 50s, which we did the study guide on last week, which is on the correct handling of contradictions among the masses, or the earlier one on New Democracy, Mao emphasizes that there are capitalists within China, within the People's Republic of China, that they form parts of the masses known as the people, but they are expected to behave in certain ways, and they're going to be politically educated to behave in certain ways. And that the ultimate aim of the Chinese revolutionary state, the Chinese state which is, Mao comes to the point, say it's a state run by the proletariat and the peasantry. He doesn't use the word at that stage, dictatorship of the proletariat, but he comes close to using it. He said it's people's democratic dictatorship, basically. Now, it seems to me that in this new era, the Xi Jinping leadership is trying to work back towards that. There's been a lot said recently about re-establishing party branches in workplaces, making sure that the party is embedded in all the major state industries, and making sure that it remains embedded within the working class areas. Now, all of that is a positive step. Now, here's where I think there's problems that, of course, what I would call the China fanboys don't want to address, is that you can strengthen the party immeasurably, which undoubtedly has been done over the past 10 years, but you're still going to be running into problems because the mere fact of the operation of capitalist commodity production in China and the growth of this national bourgeoisie has within it the scope to create new contradictions which might, to draw from Mao's analysis again, become antagonistic. So the party has got to be constantly revolutionizing itself in order to be able to deal with the contradictions that come up from having a growing domestic capitalist class. So how that's going to be handled in terms of the Chinese party's objectives of a moderately prosperous socialist society by, I believe it's 2049, the 100th anniversary of the revolution. That's going to be an interesting thing to see over the next 25 years or so. Are they going to be able to handle those contradictions? I hope, for the benefit of the workers of the world, and especially the workers of China, that they will be able to handle this. Certainly, I would say that they're going in the right direction. I think that ultimately they will need to restore the dictatorship of the proletariat. They will need to go back to ways of making sure that the masses are as involved in the governance of the state and the economy as it's possible to have them be, because only that's going to secure the revolution in the long term. I think that the revolutionary wing of the Chinese party knows that, and we're in a long period of internal struggle in the party in China, which of course will be influenced by the class struggle in China, as this has been. It's not just a matter of debate between the delegates to the National People's Congress or the congresses of the party itself. It's a matter of the class struggle inside China. And if you look at the reports that have come out over the last 10 to 14 years or so about class struggle in China, the struggle has been picking up. And in the Yang Zemin and Hu Jintao periods, especially the later Hu Jintao period, there was much more class struggle inside China, as there was, by the way, in the period of the People's Democratic Dictatorship, and described by Mao in the 50s. There was strikes then that had to be resolved. There were contradictions then that had to be resolved. And so the increased activity of the Chinese working class has actually pushed the Chinese party back in the direction of re-energizing the connection with the masses. And I think that's good. I think that the party has so far responded properly to the increased number of strikes, and it needs to continue to do so, because they might have achieved all these successes, and indeed the successes that Martinez and others outline particularly the anti-poverty campaign, all of that is real and should never be underestimated. But again, like, there is the ongoing contradiction, which may turn into an antagonism, of the role of the domestic ruling class. Well, capitalist class, shall we say. The domestic capitalist class will, of course, push for more and more control over the system. So strengthening the party in the masses and hopefully restoring properly the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was done away with verbally in the Yang Zemin period, and they attempted to replace it with a load of waffling verbiage that would have been worthy of Khrushchev. So the other factor that will, of course, influence the Chinese Revolution is the revolutionary picture on a global basis. And if there's a significant movement of the working class in, well, any of the countries that are in the region of China, or even in the imperialist countries, we can see that that might strengthen the Chinese Revolution as well. So my overall judgment on the strength of the revolution is that it's still strong, it still has credibility with the masses, but that this credibility with the masses cannot be taken for granted. And I think that to give the current leadership its due, they aren't taking it for granted and are working hard to make sure that the party is embedded with the Chinese working class and peasantry as much as they possibly can. But again, this situation that has been created by the so-called reform and opening up is going to create contradictions. It's going to need to be dealt with. Now, with regard to the other aspects of Sam's question, so social credit system, you look into that and what you will find is that it's actually it consists of several things. And these several aspects get lumped together by imperialists in the press and dingbat right-wingers and reactionaries who start screaming about it. What it is that there's several things, as I say. There is the attempt to open up a domestic credit market to boost domestic consumption. Think of that what you will, but that's one side of it. So they were attempting to set up credit ratings agencies. Or credit ratings for Chinese citizens, which they didn't have before. There was a report in the Financial Times about that a couple of years ago. The other thing, of course, is the system whereby people's social behavior is judged. And quite frankly, in the case of China, I think this is fundamentally a good idea. I mean, if you behave in an antisocial fashion, then your standing in society should be damaged. Now, of course, as I said earlier, with the restoration of capitalist production and, of course, all that brings, negative social behavior is encouraged, but the Chinese are trying to find ways to curb that, and so the system whereby they actually throw up on for public trial the corrupt officials is good. The active disincentivization of negative social behavior or antisocial behavior is a good thing. And one of the reasons why, of course, when various Western politicians say look at what they think the Chinese are doing and say, oh, we should have that here. One of the reasons why that doesn't work, of course, is that our imperialist nations are in such a state of profound decay that the only option that the capitalist state is able to exercise is not through social pressure on people, it's just through punitive responses. So Tony Blair, for instance, this was one of his big ideas. It'll come back with Keir Starmer, I'm sure, was the whole idea around antisocial behaviour orders. This was one of his big things. And of course, this initially did have a degree of popularity amongst certain workers because nobody likes their estate being ruined by a bunch of arseholes. So the whole point about the policy was supposed to be to prevent so-called antisocial behaviour. The problem with it is, though, this is being implemented by the British state, which is, of course, a capitalist state, an imperialist state with a profoundly reactionary view of the masses, and therefore its whole approach to this was just to use the police agencies to try and solve the problem. It had no concept of a redevelopment of these areas, to re-educate people, to re-immerse them back into the working class again. And it just used the state as a sledgehammer. Now, of course, you could see a decline in antisocial behavior by doing that, but it's temporary and isn't going to actually make much difference. So with regard to the Communist Party of China's efforts, I think the most effective guarantee of getting rid of antisocial attitudes in China, which have grown in recent years, is actually to pursue the project that they're doing at the moment and to restore the role of the masses fully in the governance of society, to continue with the line they're on at the moment, and to reverse the damage that was done to that in the Deng, Yang, and Hu era. If the masses are constantly engaged with, and they know that the state and economy and society are theirs and work for them, and that it is their responsibility to make sure that it goes forward in a positive fashion, then the masses will feel a sense of ownership, and therefore antisocial attitudes that a minority, or antisocial behavior that a minority might engage in, will be much, much less likely, because of the way in which the development of the masses' consciousness is encouraged by that direct involvement in the running of society, in the running of the economy. That's the best way to actually guarantee against these problems. What the Chinese are doing at the moment is trying to find a way to counterbalance the damage that's been done by the restoration of capitalist commodity production. But of course, you can have techno solutions, you can have solutions to exert pressure on people, you can have surveillance systems to pick this up. But in the end, the lessons taught by Mao will have to be returned to, including some of the lessons from the Cultural Revolution, which the current Chinese leadership really doesn't want to engage in, or at least doesn't want to engage in openly. So the final point about the engagement with things like creatures like Gates and Fauci and others, well, there's a big question which the Chinese leadership would need to be asked internally about, well, why on earth did they allow the Americans to open that lab in Wuhan in the first place? Why were they allowing that to happen? What did the Americans promise them? Because certainly it probably wasn't worth it. So that's a big question that would need to be asked internally inside China. And also the engagement with people like Gates and the other idiots, and also the taking up of the climate change narrative in certain ways. I would say all that reflects the fact that there is still a strong revisionist and opportunist wing of the Chinese party. It's clear. Again, go and read the speeches of Xi himself when it comes to things like the addressing like reform and opening up. You get like completely contradictory statements being made in there. He'll say on the one hand, quite correctly, that socialism must be strengthened by increasing the role of the masses in the party and the state. And on the other hand, and this can only be done by more reform and opening up. Now, I know that political leaders have to dance a fine line, but of course that is clearly the line that expresses the contradictions within the party, because you have on the one hand a revolutionary wing which wants to push further on the socialist road. On the other hand, you have a revisionist wing and a pro-capitalist wing. So this is the status of the revolution in China. I would say it's an active revolutionary process, and the struggles inside the party go on. So this is one, I would say, to re-emphasize a point. We should hope, all of us, that the revolutionary wing of the Chinese party succeeds and that the Chinese revolution succeeds. And of course, this ultimately will be the decision of the Chinese working class themselves. They are a very powerful proletariat, possibly the most powerful in the world, and it will be their say-so as to how much the Chinese leadership succeeds in its attempt to re-engage and revive the connection with the masses that had strayed away in the 90s and 2000s. So, pausing now to say hello to others who are in the chat. So, good afternoon to Jerry and Robeson, my comrade Jason, Roddy, Lachlan, Junior Cadiz, Alexandros, who says China, unlike most Western countries, has no uniformed national social credit scheme system. There is no Experian, etc. It's entirely correct. Brian Kelly, who's coming to us from Japan. So, well, good evening to you. I think you're, what, 8-9 hours ahead there? He has a couple of questions related to the CPB. That's the Communist Party of Britain. Okay, well, we'll take your questions first then, as you're coming to us, I think, from the furthest away. If you're further away and watching this than Brian is, do let us know. I'm curious to say. Question comes in. What do you say to CPB when they focus on influencing the Labour Party in parliamentary democracy? And that is why we have the NHS, better housing conditions for the working class, 45 to 51 Labour government, etc. Well, I would say to the CPB, and I've read their documents where they claim that the reason why we got 45 to 51 was partly because of the strength of the Communist Party in pressuring Labour from the left and working to get the Labour Party elected was positive in that sense. I would say that there is absolutely no way that the British ruling class could not have reformed in 1945, given that they were bankrupt. They were incredibly weak. They'd mobilized and had to mobilize most of the working age population and some of the older population to win the ultimate victory over Nazi Germany in 1945, even though, of course, their role was ultimately a supporting role to the real war that was being, or the bulk of the war that was being waged by the USSR. Given the state of play at the time, they were very much weakened. The prestige of socialism and the USSR was such that they could not avoid reform. Even the US imperialists knew they had to allow the West Germans, the French, the Italians, and the British, and the Nordic countries that had been occupied by the Germans to engage in some social democratic reformism. The role of the CP in that time, in terms of pushing for a Labour government, was negligible. What wasn't negligible was the fact that the mood of the domestic working class was such that to refuse reform would have been to invite revolution. Now, I'm sure that the CPGB's cadres at the time, because remember, the CPB is not the same as the old Communist Party of Great Britain. It's a split derived from the late 1980s that claims the continuity with that party. So the old CPGB did undoubtedly have influence within the most militant sections of the working class. That's true. Now, I would say that it's a combination of the strength of the domestic working class in which the CPGB played a role, but also the international situation, the international picture of class struggle, and the huge prestige of socialism that delivered the reforms from the 45 to 51 period. Now, the CPGB's conclusion from that particular period, where they had 2 MPs in the Houses of Parliament, in the House of Commons in Britain, Willie Gallagher, and I forget the second guy's name. The conclusions that they drew in their first document that came out of that period, in their analysis in the first British Road to Socialism of 1951, drew all the wrong lessons from that period. They got it 180 degrees wrong, or if we're going along Annalena Baerbock's geometry, 360 degrees wrong. So they concluded from that period that a peaceful transition to socialism was possible in Britain. They say that quite openly. If you read the discussions between Harry Pollitt and Stalin, they did have some discussions about the content of that document. Pollitt is claiming that the Communist Party of Great Britain, yes, and Pollitt was the other MP, as Irish Partisan points out. He claimed in the discussions with Stalin that it was possible that the Communist Party of Great Britain could enter into a permanent or semi-permanent coalition with the Labour Party, and that with Labour victory supported by the Communist Party, you could see Britain transition over to a people's democracy, as it was the case in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and of course, you could argue, Albania, though that was more straight up a communist revolution by that stage. And to a certain extent, Yugoslavia, there was a big argument about the Titoite system there that I'm sure we can have at some stage. Now, this analysis is fundamentally wrong because it fails to address the proper balance of class forces in Britain versus the balance of those forces in the Eastern European countries. In Poland and all the other countries after 1945, not only was it the case that the Red Army had liberated those places and the power of the old domestic bourgeoisie and aristocracy, because a lot of those places were still running under almost semi-feudal systems, the power of the domestic ruling classes was smashed. Many of them had collaborated with the Nazis, such as in Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria, and their collaboration with the Nazis shattered whatever credibility they might have had. So by the time you get to the establishment of the people's democracies in Eastern and Central Europe, it's not that, as the anti-communists say, that the Red Army just imposed these systems. There was a domestic revolution going on in which the communist parties were a minority in some cases, but they were a very important minority in that they were the most organized and effective fighters in the working class, and that they were in genuine workers' anti-fascist coalitions with various different forces that ended up forming often coalition governments. And in the case of places like East Germany, you got the Socialist Unity Party being formed out of a merger of the old KPD and the old Social Democracy. Of course, though all those countries had their issues anyway. But my point is, the reason why the People's Democratic Revolution was able to go through in all of those places, with all of its flaws, was the fact that the power of the domestic ruling class had been shattered completely. The old state had been destroyed. That was not the case in Britain. Britain was weakened. The British ruling class were weakened after 1945, but they were not destroyed in the same way that they were in Hungary or in Romania, and they weren't damaged by their association, their open association with fascism. They, in fact, were able to secure some prestige for themselves by being seen to be on the right side of World War II, even though that was a dubious thing to claim at best. So the analysis of the CPGB in 1951 and since then was wrong. The British ruling class were not in the weakened position that, like, the Hungarians were or the Poles were. They were never going to be as weakened as that. Unless the only way they were going to be as weakened as that was if the Nazis had invaded and a whole bunch of the ruling class openly collaborated with them, which would have happened, by the way, had the Nazi invasion happened and succeeded. So the analysis of the CPGB is wrong because it underestimated the strength of the British ruling class and their ability to reimpose their will and stop the reform process. They also fundamentally made a mistake when it came to the analysis of the Labour Party. The Communist Party of Great Britain was never in a coalition with the Labour Party, nor would the Labour Party leaders ever accept it, either in the 1920s, the 1940s, the 1950s, or now. They never accepted a coalition or any even cooperation with the Communist Party of Great Britain as it was. So what Pollitt and the other leaders did back in 1951 was they tied the Communist Party of Great Britain to the Labour Party, which I will re-emphasize is a pro-imperialist party, is a party which from its earliest point of existence has enthusiastically and rabidly defended British capitalism and the institutions of the British state. So what Pollitt and the other leaders did was that they tied the most militant section of the working class hand and foot to an imperialist reactionary party, and they had no influence over whatsoever, and they pretended that they did. They sold a complete lie to their own membership and to the wider working class, and they damaged the development of a communist politics within the working class for the next 70 years, and were still being damaged by that utterly contemptible and disastrous and ridiculous decision. Now, it's possible that in the heat of the moment that your judgment can err, that you can make a mistaken analysis. And in the period of 45 to 51, perhaps it is understandable that the leaders of the CPGB made mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. The point is, you have to reanalyze the situation. And after 1965 to 1970, the second big period of Labour government after World War II, you could not justify sticking to the position that voting Labour was advancing the cause of working class power and was advancing us towards some kind of people's democracy. And yet, not only in Britain, but also in France and Italy, that lie was maintained. And slowly, the Communist Party of Great Britain started to merge with the Labour aristocracy and started to become almost identical with the left wing of the Labour Party. It started to become more and more divorced from the militant sections of the working class until it was the case that by the time you get to the 70s, the working class militants were joining like Trotskyist parties who talked a better game. So they were joining like the old International Socialists, and they were joining the WRP, for fuck's sake, because these were organizations that spoke the language of militant class struggle. The reality of them and their disastrous political judgments was revealed later, but the CPGB had essentially, in many areas, abandoned the field of struggle. So this is the disaster that we're faced with, thanks to that opportunistic analysis of Pollitt and the others in 1951. And I would encourage you to read the CPGBML analysis, full analysis of the British road to socialism, how it was a disaster in the 50s and it's a disaster now. So I hope that gives Brian an answer to the question. Just as an addendum to Brian's question there, had there been a Communist Party which remained a genuine revolutionary party that focused on rooting itself in the advanced working class and not going around making excuses for the Labour Party and the trade union bureaucracy and trying to embed itself within the Labour aristocracy, then by the time we got to the period of militant class struggles in the late 60s and early 70s, those struggles could have looked an awful lot different with an effective Marxist-Leninist party to actually work within them and hopefully rise to lead them. We could have seen revolutionary opportunities emerge in Britain, but we didn't, because the Communist Party and all the Trots as well, despite the fact they pretended not to be, were all still handcuffing the working class to the dead weight of the Labour aristocracy and the Labour Party in TUC. To elaborate further, and Brian asks another question here, what are your thoughts on Andrew Murray of the CPB? Lately I saw him taking the soft left line on anti-Semitism stuff, and the other day I read an article of his arguing that Russia was imperialist. Brian, if you've got the link to that article, put it in the chat, because I want to read it. I think that Murray is a contemptible individual, to be completely honest. I think his leadership of the Corbyn movement, and he was a leader in the Corbyn movement, was a disaster. He represents all the worst traditions of the Communist Party of Britain. He has a family dynasty in soft left politics. I believe his daughter took part in the witch hunts of Corbyn supporters, helping to falsely accuse them of anti-Semitism. He's a wretched Labour aristocracy bureaucrat who has been a bane on every organisation he's ever been a part of. He's part of the reason why the Stop the War coalition is an ineffectual pseudo-pacifist mess. His and the Communist Party of Britain's analysis on Russia as imperialist is doing the work of the Foreign Office and the State Department, and it has led to the British anti-war movement being paralysed and completely ineffectual. People like him need to be thrown into the dustbin of history where he belongs. He's a disaster. He shouldn't be indulged, and nor should anybody who cooperates with him. I hope that was a direct enough answer to your question. Jerry says, what we had in 1945 was due to a unique circumstances and regime scared of revolution. Very true. Dealing with the antisocial behaviour via the courts is a really, really slow process, says Rob, that leads to apathy amongst those affected. A CBO hearing actually locally recently cancelled because the Wi-Fi was down, adding more weeks. Well, The court system in Britain is also a joke, as Rob is implying there heavily. So, yes, in agreement with that comment. Banana Bender is in Australia, which is further away from Japan. Okay. Of course you are. Yes, I remember now. Banana Bender says, to me, it's far better for communists to try and take over the unions than to get better political parties voted into parliament. Well, we've got a question on the unions coming right up. So, Telltale says, will US imperialism drop British imperialism in the end, like they have done elsewhere? If British imperialism can no longer play a useful role for US imperialism, then there'll be no sentimentality there. Remember, there are no permanent allies, only permanent interests. Lord Palmerston said that. And ultimately, not immediately, but within a few years, possibly within the next decade, I think, the US will leave Europe. I'm convinced of that. I think ultimately the US will retreat out of Europe. They will first of all try to focus on solidifying what they've got in the Asia-Pacific region. And when that fails, they'll attempt to reassert total control over Central and Southern America and the Caribbean. Now, all of this, of course, is contingent upon the domestic class struggles in the United States as well, but I think that's the direction it's heading. The British are terrified of the US withdrawing from Europe because if the British can't act as the pilot fish for US imperialism, then the British have no role. Also, without US imperialism's military backing, British imperialism cannot sustain the protection of its investments overseas. So when the US is done with Europe and done with Britain, British imperialism and European imperialism is done too. And I think that's coming, and I think that's something we should welcome as a huge opportunity. So, Karen Mendes, tuning in again from Germany. This channel is a breath of fresh air. It is chaotically chilling here. Well, it's chaotic across Europe at the moment, Karen, but I see what you mean. Good afternoon to Zuleika. Telltale asked, do you think if Stalin had lived for another 15 years, he would have stopped revisionism and the collapse of the USSR? Well, that's a very large question. There is evidence to suggest that Stalin was preparing to instigate a purge of the party again before he died. That is part of what leads to the questions over, was he murdered or not? I think probably not, but certainly he was aware of the opportunist trend within the Soviet Party and was trying to take active measures against it. Now, of course, it's not just down to one man, but then again, also leadership is tremendously important. Had somebody with all of Stalin's authority and prestige called upon the masses to take action against the revisionists and the opportunists, well, we could have got a situation akin to the Cultural Revolution in China, though, of course, Stalin was a much more experienced revolutionary in some respects, so he could have designed a better process. But I will say that had Stalin lived another 5 or 10 years and had been able to instigate a cultural revolution type process inside the USSR, then it certainly improves the possibilities of the party being strong enough to survive revisionism, and also revisionism not having as much time to grow to its full and foul expression under Gorbachev. So it's possible. I mean, we're into the realm of the speculative there, but it's clear that he understood the challenges that were facing the party and the weaknesses that were there as well. Again, whether he would have been able to lead a cultural revolution type movement against the opportunists in the party, that's another question. But had he lived another 10 years, it certainly increases the possibility that that would have been the case. Right. Rob says, it's surprising that the old CPG didn't realise that their position in the Imperial Core would require a different strategy. Maybe the triumph of the Red Army in World War II led to overconfidence. It's partly that. I have come to the conclusion that it's also partly that I think there was a failure to understand the strength of reformism and social democratic tendencies in the workers' movement in Britain, which are very deeply embedded. And they failed to understand those, I think, and also to understand that their role as a communist party was not to compete with the Labour Party or to assist the Labour Party in getting votes. Their role was to find and develop the militant workers. And they got caught up in this opportunistic formulation. And of course, what it led them into was it led them into being embedded in the networks of the Labour left and the left of the TUC bureaucracy, which of course encouraged further opportunism in the old CPGB. But I think the point that Rob is making in his comment there is correct, which is it comes from a total misunderstanding of their position in the imperial core. It's possible to, if you're in Bolivia or Ecuador or Venezuela or Brazil, it's possible to, as a communist, support a social democratic party. But of course, doing so in the imperial core is a completely different endeavor, a reactionary endeavor, because of the influence of imperialism in creating and sustaining the labor aristocracy and all the ruinous effects that that has on working class organization. Irish Partisan says, James Connolly despised the Labour Party and union bureaucracy, especially given their support for colonialism in World War One. And James Connolly was exactly right on that, as he was on an awful lot of other things as well. We should do a Connolly programme at some stage soon. Japan is 8 hours ahead of Britain. So it's near midnight. Well, thanks for tuning in to the midnight hour in that case. Irish Partisan asks, what are my thoughts on Derek Hatton and the militant movement in the 80s? For those of you who are unaware, the militant tendency was a Trotskyite movement that was part of the Labour Party in the 70s and 80s. And it spawned the party which I used to be a member of, which is the Socialist Party of England and Wales, or SPEW for short. Their tactics were sort of old-school Trotskyite entrism, which is to try and build up what they would call, I would disagree with this now, they would call a revolutionary tendency within the Labour Party, in order that when a Labour government got in, that there would be a crisis and that the militant, would be in a position to influence the direction of the Labour Party, and particularly if it was a left-led Labour government, and to push it in the direction of taking radical actions against British capitalism. What was the old phrase they used to use? Nationalise the top 100 monopolies. That was the demand they used to put forward. They were associated with backing the left campaigns of people like Tony Benn and others. And they got to the point where they had a controlling influence within the Labour group that ran Liverpool City Council in the 1980s. And they were ultimately purged by the Kinnock leadership and all chucked out. But I think ultimately, to answer Irish Partisan's question, the militant made the same mistake that the CPGB made, which is in thinking that you can work in the Labour Party. And yes, they made more progress than many others. But one of the things they missed, along with the CPGB and almost everybody else in the British left missed, was that the working class themselves had turned against the Labour Party, or at least become very sceptical of it, from at least the early 60s. You see that there's a dip in the vote for the Labour Party after 1951. 1951 is their high point. And of course, they lost the second election in the early 1950s to the Conservatives, despite getting a massive turnout and a massive number of votes. So they had a mass organisation, the Labour Party, of members and members associated with them through the trade union movement in the 50s. That all falls away in the 60s until by the time militant enters the Labour Party in the late 60s, early 70s, they're kind of pushing at an open door, because this isn't a mass organisation of the working class anymore. Militant, and to this day, by the way, the international Marxist tendency claim this, that somehow this was a mass organisation supported by the working class still. It wasn't. The working class still voted for it, and you could argue, back then you could argue, that the trade union movement, of course, was a mass working class movement, but the Labour Party wasn't. The working class in Britain still continues to vote Labour, or at least a section of it did, but the engagement with the Labour Party had all fallen away. So by the time Militant join, they're able to take over some of these organisations, because in Liverpool and Manchester to a certain extent, and other places, mainly Liverpool though, because the local Labour parties were completely dead. They were dead in that they were just run as bureaucratic operations by the Labour Party and the trade union bureaucracy. The idea that was defended by the militant leaders at the time, including Hatton, but he wasn't really the theoretician. The working class intellectual involved was a guy called Tony Mulhern, who I met a couple of times and had enormous respect for, because he'd actually put his neck out in this struggle and had suffered financially as a result of being on the Liverpool Council and getting blacklisted out of it by the Labour Party and not being able to get work afterwards, except as I believe he was a cab driver on nights for quite a long time afterwards. But they made a fundamental mistake in thinking that the working class was ever going to be enthusiastic about the Labour Party in the way that the Labour Party did benefit from an upsurge in working class enthusiasm in the 1940s. Again, as Jerry says in her comment, and as I've been emphasising, a unique set of circumstances that's never going to be wholly repeated again. Labour Party by the 80s had a reputation that was in the sewer amongst much of the working class, and the 80s didn't improve it. So in the end, you got a lot of people struggling for a long time to try and take over Labour Party branches. And again, I'd argue that they didn't make the Labour Party one iota more socialist. What it did was it actually took people who considered themselves to be Marxist, however flawed their analysis might have been, and it made them essentially more Labourites. It made a lot of them more social democratic. And this was even admitted to me in conversations I had with Socialist Party full-timers later on, is that they had an organisation at one point they were claiming, let's give them some leeway and say that their figures are accurate. They claimed 10,000 supporters in the Labour Party in 1987, 88. Now, they found that when they tried to leave, they lost all of those because, of course, many of these people had no conception of politics outside of the Labour Party. The militant tendency had not equipped them for a conception of Marxist politics outside of Labour. And so they weren't training their members properly at all, which is, I mean, they weren't trained. Their whole theory was wrong in the first place in thinking that they could drag this party of imperialism towards a proletarian politics, or at least create conditions whereby you could secure a split from it. All of that is just not possible because, as we discovered with Corbyn, the hold that the British state has over the Labour Party is unbreakable. And the hold that it has also over the trade union bureaucracy is also unbreakable. I'll come to more on that in a moment. So, yeah, militant, ultimately a failure, an interesting thing to study, but ultimately based on totally flawed analysis. And so even when they succeeded, what they were doing essentially was they weren't making a revolutionary movement. They were making basically a left social democratic one that imploded as soon as Kinnock pulled the plug on them, basically. And their lingering impact was not much in reality. Hello to Martin out there over there on the, I believe, the east coast of the United States. Could be wrong about that. Do correct me if I am. Beans asks, is it just me that wonders that when imperialist countries get scared of revolution, they offer us things that communism has, but a lighter version of it to convince us capitalism is good? Well, that is exactly what they did in 1945. I mean, they were frightened enough to do it. And also, US imperialism was strong enough and had a dominant enough position to be able to afford to finance certain reforms. Remember, they loaned the British ruling class an awful lot of money after World War II in order to rebuild, and France and Italy as well, and West Germany. And so that was when American imperialism had more productivity to the domestic US capitalism and was able to afford reforms. Now it's completely changed in many respects because the condition of US imperialism is such, and it has degenerated so far, that it can't even amp up its domestic production of war material in a hurry because its productive base has eroded so far. The imperialist system has become so corroded that it's not possible to reform it anymore. It was just about possible in 1945. It's not possible now. So you're right about the 45 to 51 period, and social democracy was used as a shop window for imperialism for a very long time. In fact, people were discussing on the Telegram group just before we started this stream about the way in which Joseph Borrell's garden and the vision of this sort of pseudo-social democratic EU is sold to people across Eurasia, successfully sold to people. And this is the great illusion that they hold out for people. And it's one of the reasons why we need to deconstruct it, analyze it properly, and expose it for the illusion that it is. Martin says, the USA may keep Europe, but to serve as an adjunct to whatever it's trying to do in Africa via AFRICOM and the Bretton Woods institutions. That's an interesting point to consider. Their position in Africa, well, they may mean that they want to hang on to the EU for a while, but the other thing to say is, of course, that the EU might disintegrate. There's huge contradictions and antagonisms growing between many of the different countries inside the EU, and also class contradictions inside those countries as well. I'm thinking, of course, Germany. And if Germany gets disrupted, then the entire EU project is at risk. It may get exploded anyway with the tensions that do exist between Germany and Poland, or Hungary and various other countries. So interesting to see where US imperialism goes if those contradictions explode. Good morning to Michael Hodgson. Rob says, the court system is indeed a joke. I'd have been more explicit but ran out of characters in my last comment. Okay. The Connolly program is a popular idea, apparently. Okay. So, moving on, and I'm going to take another question. This time I'm going to handle a question from my comrade Terry from the Class Consciousness Project. What do you think about the breakaway from the Fire Brigades Union and the wildcat strike at Hinkley Point by building workers? Could these be inroads into forming new unions? Well, the question comes about because, of course, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the wholly contemptible and useless and wretched nature of the Trades Union Congress in Britain. You will have seen recently, I'm sure, if you've been following me on X or Telegram, that both the English and the Scottish Trade Union Congress passed resolutions in solidarity with Ukraine, which of course is a joke. They aren't showing solidarity with Ukraine. None of this is about solidarity with Ukraine. It's about supporting US and British imperialism. So conversations have been had in many different venues about, well, what is the way forward, given that not only are they manifestly failing the trade unions in most areas of industry, most areas that need organizing that aren't organized, the unions aren't doing jack shit about. So what is the way forward? And as Terry suggests there in his question, you've got now a breakaway union emerging in the London region that covers the fire brigade. Now, again, to explain briefly, in Britain we have one union that covers the firefighters as a profession. It's one of the older unions in the country, at least 100 years old. And it is now splitting apart in this country, with the London region becoming rebellious, and it looks like there's going to be a proper split there. And that would, of course, be a significant development. Now, the question is, of course, why? And I can handle some of those points here. Now, the London Firefighters Breakaway Union is citing significant failures, both industrially and organisationally, by the leadership of the Fire Brigades Union, led by a gentleman called Matt Rack, who I have met a few times. I won't claim I know him, but he always seemed, back when I was a Trotskyite, to be one of the better trade union leaders. The reality, of course, is somewhat different. In reality, Matt Rack talks a big game, much like Dave Ward of the Communication Workers Union, and doesn't deliver much. Now, Rack came to power as General Secretary around about 20 years ago, following a very big strike by Fire Brigades Union members that was made in response to the attempts at cutting back the service done by the Labour government of Tony Blair. And the position of the former General Secretary at the time, a guy called Andy Gilchrist, was seen to be compromised by the fact that he was a Labour Party member and he'd voiced support for Blair in the past. And of course, that's an entirely correct point. It was compromised by that. And I think that at the time, many of us saw that the leadership was under enormous pressure from the rank and file to act. So it did declare a number of significant strikes, and the government used the armed forces to try and break those strikes by wheeling out like these 1950s fire engines that they used to run to break strikes, called the Green Goddesses, which I believe had speeds that were restricted to about 30 to 40 miles an hour. And they were so old they didn't have sirens on them. They just rang bells as they went through the street. I think they've done away with those now. When they're strike breaking these days, they use slightly older fire engines to do it now. They've done away with like the antiques. Some collector probably has them by now. But that was a very significant strike, and ultimately Gilchrist and the leadership did fold over it, and their reputation was justifiably damaged. So Matt Rack and others like Paul Embry, who was a former ally of Rack's, formed a rank and file organisation and successfully campaigned for the leadership positions within the Fire Brigades Union, and struck a different tone and promised to fight harder. And I think for the first few years this did produce some results. Now, it should be said that the Fire Brigades Union, along with all the other unions in the public sector, has been under enormous pressure since the 2010s, with the relentless cutbacks to the public sector being put in place. So not an easy time for any trade union leadership. Everybody would agree with that. And I think the workers in the firefighters would understand that. The problem is, and I can remember this being a point of controversy 10 years ago, actually longer, 12 years ago, was that the FBU leadership repeatedly refused to engage in national strikes when it would have made a difference. They got easily bought off by fake concessions from the government over the firefighters' pension scheme. And Jason chimes in and says, apparently Andy Gilchrist ended up working at the RMT, that's the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union in Britain, after the FBU binned him. Successfully or unsuccessfully, Jason, if you wouldn't mind elaborating. I'd be curious to know what happened to Gilchrist. To go back to the FBU leadership under Rack. Rack and the others, in my view, and if there's any FBU members listening, I welcome any opinions you have on this, pulled their punches 10 years ago in the struggle over firefighters' pensions. They got divided too easily. Because some members of the FBU are in the local government pension scheme, those are, I believe, the call handlers and the emergency dispatch call handlers, they got treated differently to the firefighters, who of course have their own pension scheme, and the union got sort of divided because those in the LGPS went on strike and the main body of the firefighters didn't. And that was a bit of a blow, because the firefighters, of course, have significant industrial power, because of course if they go on strike, then not only is it the case that the government's having to use the state's resources to try and break the strike, but they're also they'll also call into question like whether certain entertainment venues or businesses can open without active fire service cover. And of course, then if the strike goes on and the firefighters stop doing like health and safety inspections, that's going to affect businesses as well. So the firefighters are one of the groups of organised workers in Britain with significant industrial power, if they were willing to use it. And I think that the RAC leadership failed to use it successfully when they could have done over the firefighters' pension, and also over cutbacks in fire service numbers as well. Rack, and on reflection, I should have seen this at the time, but I perhaps was too convinced by his rhetoric, consistently failed to mobilise firefighters for a national strike. He consistently grabbed hold of any offer of negotiations or a review or something that the government at the national level offered him. And he essentially, I think, started behaving like you would consider a traditional trade union right-winger to behave. Now, at the same time, of course, he's on TV, he's on the platforms on May Day, waving the red flag and giving it all that. But he's failing to properly manage the disputes of the firefighters. And this starts to create an increasing gap between the firefighters at the base level of the union and the more active trade union representatives and the political men who support RAC and the full-time officers who support RAC. Some of the full-time officers didn't. And so there is increasing criticism of the RAC leadership going through the later 2000s, later 2010s, and you start to see this breaking out into the open over things like the dismissal of, or the driving out of Paul Embry from the union over his support for Brexit. RAC starts trying to use union funds to pay off full-time officials who've become critical of him or who he's had to got rid of for some sort of scandal or another. And the discontent starts to grow within the FBU because if the leadership's not delivering industrially, the leadership is still giving it all that in public and not delivering for the members, then, well, quite frankly, no group of workers is stupid enough to believe that they should stick with that union. If they've tried to change it and the leadership's got it so stitched up they can't change it, if the leadership's behaving routinely in an anti-democratic fashion, and if they can't influence the union anymore, well, then the workers will leave. Now, they've left in the form of this, well, they haven't left yet. They've created this London Firefighters Union as a split. RAC and the FBU leaders then tried to essentially say that you couldn't be a member of this other union and still be a member of the FBU. That, of course, isn't true. You, as a union, you can't, according to the laws in Britain, and we can talk about whether those laws should be there, but according to the law of the land, you can be a member of more than one union. I've been a member of more than one union before. When I was an anarchist, for the 5 minutes that I was a member of the Transport and General Workers Union and a member of the Industrial Workers of the World. I've also been a member of both USDOR and Unite at certain points. I've been a member of the PCS Civil Servants Union and Unite at certain points. So this is in the law that you can do that, and it's actually against the law for a union leadership to try and ban anybody from being a member of two unions. A lot of full-time officials in trade unions are members of both the union that they work for and the union for full-time officials. So this is nonsense. This is an attempt at essentially intimidating people from leaving. And if RAC had any balls, he'd address the points that the dissenting firefighters are making. But he obviously hasn't, and he's on the same path as the likes of Dave Ward. He'll probably want to end up on the red benches of the House of Lords, because this is another guy, and not just him, but the whole layer that collaborates with him, who've spent 20 years talking left but doing nothing. And that's the reality when a leadership goes down that path. You can't get away with that for too long. And RAC's got away with it for 10 years. He's not getting away with it anymore. And again, like, workers aren't stupid. They will see when a union leadership's taking the piss, and RAC's leadership has been taking the piss. So it could open up the way. I mean, let's see what happens with this London Firefighters Union breakaway. I'd be very interested to see what the position that they are taking, because London, of course, being by far the biggest city in Britain, by far the most economically significant city, has the most developed and numerous fire service. So it will be a significant change if this London Firefighters Breakaway Union becomes a union. I'm sure the employers will be delighted, because if they can split a union apart, then they think that that's an advantage for them. But workers aren't going to be restrained by what the employers might think. If they think they can do better outside of a union that's lost its way, then they will do better. Then they will form something new. Terry also mentions the Wildcat walks out at Hinkley Point Power Station. And this has happened before on various different construction sites and in areas where workers have a lot of industrial power, there's been significant walkouts over the last 10 years, including the famous Besna dispute on the building sites. And this is another site of potential splitting. And I think that when one group of workers sees another group break away from their union, I think you'll start to see more movement now. A lot of, like Unite, for instance, is a bureaucratic nightmare. It's enormous. It's unwieldy. It has a lot of different sections in it. And if one of those sections isn't being served by being lumped in with all these other different industries, then you might start to see breakaways there. And also we'll start to see workers organising themselves outside of the major unions in areas of the economy where the unions just aren't active. For instance, I was on in the trade union lay bureaucracy for most of the last decade. And I was involved in all these different talking shops, which is all they were, talking about, oh, we need to organise precarious workers, we need to organise zero contract workers, we need to organise workers in catering, in retail. And all it was talk. There is now some movement on unionising Amazon workers. Of all unions, the GMB, maybe the worst union in the country other than the UCU, is actually starting to do stuff around that. But workers will find a way. Now, it's more difficult for those, like the firefighters have a union history. They have a 100-year unionised tradition. They have many experienced men and women in their ranks who know how to set up a union branch and know how to make it run. For those in the ununionised industries, particularly those who are younger and don't have experience, it's going to be difficult. But this is where I'll point everybody in the direction of the Class Consciousness Project. One of the things that we are interested in doing is working up resources to help people who are looking to carry out unionisation campaigns in areas where there is no history of unionisation. That's one of our objectives, to actually reach those people and engage with them. So check out our material on the CCP website if you haven't done so already. Right, catch up with comments. Apparently Andy Gilchrist became an education officer for the RMT. Okay. Jerry says, it's a shame from my fairly limited experience of firefighters, they seem a workforce who are particularly informed. Yeah, they are. And I think a lot of them thought that they had a fighting leadership with RAC, and it turned out not to be the case. They're not the only ones who've gone down that route. If you look at the antics of Mr. Sawatka and his crew in the civil service, I mean, a lot of people, including me, thought that they were serious. They weren't. Everybody got taken for a ride on that one. And again, these are difficult struggles to wage, but you can only talk loud and say nothing for a very long time, to paraphrase James Brown. And it's in other areas too. A lot of areas are being, like the CWU. It wouldn't surprise me if in the end a group of postal workers decide to split off from the CWU. The betrayal of them by Dave Ward and others has been that deep and that awful that you might get a split there as well. Why would you stay in a union that's openly collaborated with the employers and giving you the finger? Why should you? The old phrase is stay and fight. Well, if you stay and fight for years and years and years and you get nowhere, at a certain point you have to make an appeal like these London firefighters have done and find a certain mass of union members and workers who are prepared to go with you to a new organisation. At a certain point, you have to leave. At a certain point, you have to roll the dice and see what happens. Otherwise, you're just going to be on an endless treadmill of bureaucracy and going nowhere. And that's what many of us have been doing. I'm sure it's the case in other unions in other imperialist countries as well. The union leaderships are so ingrained in the management systems of the state and the employers that no change is possible within those unions. Now, also bear in mind, as Marx himself correctly said, that trade unionism is only ever a stage through which the working class passes through on its way somewhere else. But that period should be one that is educational and empowering for the workers, and not one that is just purely leading to defeats and sellouts. Right. Iris Partisan says, they didn't know that I was a wobbly. Yeah, at two periods in the early 2000s and again in the early 2010s. Haven't been for the last 10 years, though. Jason says, I know union reps who are members of 2 trade unions, one so they could be a rep and another in case they needed a rep. Yeah, very true story. Run into that a few times. Irish Partisan says, I was a member of Unite and SIP2, the latter tied top to bottom with the Irish Labour Party and the union bureaucracy, and the former tied top to bottom with the British Labour Party and union bureaucracy. So that's a double dose of awful there, Irish Partisan, but many of us have experienced that. Roddy expresses enthusiasm for the James Connolly programme. Well, I'll have to start looking into that. Jerry says, I was thinking those needing 2 to 3, working 2 to 3 jobs might need more union memberships, but they struggle to afford it. Yes, I mean, you can be covered just by a general union if you're working 2 jobs. In fact, a general union might be a good approach to use if you're working 2 to 3 jobs. Roddy says, I remember a group of union leaders being labelled the awkward squad in the early 2000s, wrongly apart from Bob Crow. Yes, that was Bob Crow, who it was accurate to say was, I think, probably the last great trade union leader in Britain. But also it was Mark Sawatka, Derek Simpson, if you remember him. I'll go into his story in just a moment. And I believe it was Dave Prentice. Now, I think he's now Baron Prentice. So that's another fine tale from British trade unionism. Just as an anecdote, and others might want to contribute if you know a Derek Simpson story. Derek Simpson was a former member of the Communist Party of Great Britain who became the leader of an old engineering and electricians union by the name of Amicus. Now, Amicus was the merger of, I believe, the Amalgamated Electricians and Engineers Union and MSF, another technicians union. And it inherited some of the most corrupt trade union officials probably in the world. And the Amicus bureaucracy was notoriously reactionary. And Simpson was elected, actually, as a rank and file choice, somewhat of a rank and file choice. He actually won on a left platform. Now, a guy I knew back in the days when I was in the Socialist Party, he's a long-standing member of MSF, and also he became a member of Unite when Amicus merged with the TNG to create Unite. But he was a member of Amicus as well in the brief period of that union's existence. And he says that he knew Derek Simpson, and Derek Simpson got elected on the left platform and ended up. This guy told me. I mean, this is rumours, but I've seen things in the trade union movement that are similar to this, so I think that this is true. That Simpson got elected and he took with him people from the left of the union to work in the office, and that the old right-wing bureaucrats took Simpson out for a weekend's drinking and debauchery, and after that he completely changed. He got rid of all the left-wingers who'd run his campaign and became a bog-standard, Amicus right-wing general secretary. Now, this guy told me, and I've heard this story from more than one person when it comes to how these right-wing trade union bureaucrats used to operate and still do, which is that they figured that Simpson had been compromised somehow on his dirty weekend, shall we say, and that basically they'd got blackmail material on him and says, well, Derek, we can make it an easy ride for you if you go along with the way we run things, but if you're going to insist on sticking with that lunatic commie platform that you ran on, well, we might have to show the photos of what you got up to in Blackpool last weekend. That was the story I heard. Knowing what goes on in certain trade union bureaucracies, I would not be surprised if there's more than a grain of truth in that. The other thing Derek Simpson is, of course, famous for is going along with the slogan "British jobs for British workers," appearing on the front cover of the Daily Star, waving a couple of Union Jacks and with a couple of models in bikinis, looking like a sleazy, perverted old man. And, of course, on his exit from the now merged Amicus, which merged with the Transport and General Workers Union to create the union now called Unite, Simpson squirreled away for himself the property rights to a house worth at least 500 grand, possibly more, on his way out the door. And at the last meeting, apparently, of the Amicus Finance and General Purposes Committee, signed over to himself like a house and a big payoff. And this actually got covered in the national press. It got picked up that Simpson had given himself a house. Because, of course, the unions in Britain, I'm sure in other countries as well, used to have like significant real estate investments. So Simpson took one of these places for himself. He was forced in the end to give it back after it became a national scandal. But that's the kind of man who was labelled as one of the awkward squad 20 years ago. And where did they all end up? Well, unfortunately, Bob Crow left us far too soon, died prematurely in 2014, I think it was. Prentice, House of Lords. Simpson, House of Lords, I think. Sawatka, probably in the House of Lords before too long. And this is where they all end up. So, the trade union aristocracy in action. Irish Partisan says, not one of my proudest moments being a member of Unite and SIP2. Yes, as I said, we've all had them. Irish Partisan also said it was galling to watch the bureaucracy and the leadership engage in collective partnership with Bertie Ahern and the worst dregs of the reactionary Irish state. Yeah, well, we're very familiar with that over here, trust me. Roddy says, totally agree about Bob. Had the privilege of knowing him, and he was head and shoulders above any trade union leader during my working lifetime. Yeah, it's him and Scargill, really, are the two that stand out in the course of my lifetime. I mean, I don't remember Scargill at his peak, but I remember him speaking at trade union events when I was active in the union movement 10 years ago, and he's still an incredible, powerful speaker, and you can see why the state feared him. He's a man who had an iron commitment to his class and his members, and didn't quit, didn't back down, made mistakes certainly, but who doesn't under that amount of pressure? And a man whose memory we should cherish, really. And yeah, so I'll be going for 90 minutes now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this in two because I have other writing and stuff to get on with, and we're going to come back with another one of these to complete the questions that have been submitted at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can all join me for that as well. Thank you to everybody who's submitted questions on the chat and on Patreon. Same time tomorrow for this, followed by a news at 10 tomorrow at 10, ironically enough. So, thank you to everybody who's tuned in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga Don Canal.